global leaders are at the UN General Assembly in New York this weekend, most of them sounding alarm bells over a world teetering on the brink of disaster. A climate crisis that gets worse by the day, a global pandemic, vaccine disparities, growing inequity, and war, refugees as well. These are the types of big issues the UN was designed to tackle, and yet when it's needed most, it's often dysfunctional and paralyzed by inaction. So, the big question today on the Sunday Conversation, is the UN still relevant? That's what we're talking about. Joining me from Quebec City, freelance writer Nora Loretto, and in Calgary, Mosi Taylor-Cole, and he's a lawyer with Robertson LLP. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. John.
Okay. Since Mosi is the first time on the panel, we'll start with him. Let's talk about the question that we're going to ask first to both of you, though. Does the world still need the UN? Mosi.
I think it does. I mean, the UN was brought together to help to promote multilateralism. There is no other forum where you see 193 countries come together to talk about their struggles or what they plan on doing in the future for certain issues that commonly affect the world. Now, granted, yes, there's been some difficulties with the UN right now and COVID-19, but I think that, given that everybody's getting together at the General Assembly, this gives all these countries kind of a check-in to be like, okay, hey, look, I know we're concerned at home, but we do need to put a little bit of our focus to see what we can do to help other countries that maybe are not as well off as we are. So they are still very relevant.
Okay, on that note, over to you, Nora.
Yeah, I think that it's relevant as well. But it's important to look at the moment that we're in right now and just how fraught a lot of international organizations are because of the pandemic. And so the UN does give countries the opportunity to come together that aren't necessarily allied. And in theory, it should be a location where countries can develop strategies and try to help people. But we also have to recognize that COVID has really made a lot of countries, for worse, I think, look inward. And when countries are looking inward, the question is going to arise, what is the role of the UN when countries are so focused inward? And of course, we're in a moment where the global power forces are shifting and changing. And so we're seeing more than ever questioning of what is the role of the UN, but also the WHO, the WTO, and we're looking at patents and vaccine licenses given to other countries. And so I think it's more of a moment of flux rather than a moment where we should be saying, well, should it even exist at all?
Founded, of course, in 1945 and just after the Second World War. So hard to believe, 4 generations ago, arguably, in which it was established. A lot to unpack here in terms of the continued relevancy, which you both seem to argue is there, but it maybe needs a little tweaking. But let's look at this in terms of the representation. We have 1.2 billion Africans who, for example, are not on the UN to have an ability to be on the Permanent Security Council. Can we talk a bit about the way the world has changed and whether the UN has been able to keep up in that regard in terms of the mechanics of it? Mosi?
Well, definitely in terms of the way the world has changed, I mean, this is in the longest time one of the first issues with COVID-19 that we've seen that has affected every aspect of the world. Everybody has been affected by the pandemic in some way, shape, or form. And I think that is something that the UN is not fully used to. They've never had a situation where every single person in every single country is affected by this. It is a complete global crisis. And because of that, countries just can't look at the problem and maybe sometimes they push it, dust it under the rug or whatnot. They have to actually fully look at it and see what is happening. And I think that is the biggest problem that we're seeing right now. And I agree with Nora's statements earlier before, is that governments have to pay attention to what's happening. So they're focused, not because they don't want it to be internationally, is just directed here at home. And that's been the shift.
And yet we're looking at, as we're seeing with, for example, COVAX arguably not delivering the rate of vaccines that it should, that inequity existing with a number of jurisdictions, including the United States, looking at third doses now, where so much of the part of the world is still waiting for their first. Nora, what do they need to do to try to fulfill their mandate and deal with, as Mosi's been saying, the challenges of the worldwide crisis we have right now?
Yeah, well, there's really like two kinds of UN. Like there's the UN that operates programs like the food programs and human rights programs. And then there's the space that then gets the attention that we're all giving to it right now because they're all meeting at this very moment. And, I'm not sure that space has ever been all that important necessarily because countries come to that space with their geopolitical strategies already figured out. And so, you'll have speeches from leaders and the speeches might make the headlines, but I'm not sure that we should be looking at the UN as this body that has always been effective since its foundation. I think it's a body where geopolitics expresses itself. And so is it surprising that the UN hasn't been able to figure out how to come up with a global distribution strategy? Well, you already mentioned that there's a lack of representation from the African nations. And of course, the vaccine distribution on the continent is the worst of all the continents. And so, for me, what I think is more interesting to look at is how will the changing nature of American hegemony express itself different as China takes more of a place within the world? And does that change the United Nations? Does that actually change the look of who's on the Security Council? Or does that change the decisions that it makes to intervene in this country or into that country? And that I'm not sure is going to happen, because if it's not a completely effective agency already, I'm not sure that shifting power poles will make it more effective. But of course, maybe. So I think it's just a very interesting moment right now to watch this.
But as in so many areas of, let's even say, society, where you have different voices at the table, you have perspectives, you have knowledge brought in a way that you might not if those voices aren't at the table. So mostly let's talk about specifically around the pandemic and the imbalance there. If there were more African voices, if there were more South Asian voices, in terms of the power, do you think we'd see some of the dysfunction dealt with a little better?
In terms of the pandemic, I don't think so. I think the biggest problem that I've seen from when I listened to some of the speeches from the world leaders and heads of state is that every country has its own way of dealing with the pandemic as well, too. So not everybody is on the same page. I think we understand now that there are certain continents in the world that are worse off than we are here in North America when it comes to the pandemic. But we've even seen the contrast, for example, between the United States and how they've dealt with the pandemic and Brazil and how they've dealt with the pandemic when you listen to the world leaders' speeches. So I think that the disconnect part of it, too, is that everybody has their own different way of trying to tackle the pandemic. There isn't one kind of global standard, and that's making it part of the issue as well, too. Because if one country doesn't see the benefit of vaccines passports, they may not be highly as on board to give funding to the UN to be able to help out some of these other countries.
Nora, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. And I think from the Canadian perspective, we just finished a federal election where there was pretty much no discussion of foreign affairs from the main parties. And I thought that was a very interesting indication of where our leaders are at. Because, as Canadians, we should be asking, what role are we playing in the United Nations? We know that we're playing not a great role with COVAX, and that Canada needs to do more thinking of our relationship with Haiti, like Canada really needs to do a lot more to help Haitians in the aftermath of the recent earthquake. And it just seems that internationalism is not on the priorities and hasn't been on the priorities of our leadership for a long time. And how they interact with the UN is a question that I think we need to put to politicians and see, what do you think about internationalism and how do you think Canada needs to be inserting itself in various committees or in various programs or at the General Assembly itself?
All right, Nora, you anticipated my last question there, but let's talk about that. We didn't hear many international issues being brought up during the election campaign. So my last question to both of you then is, and of course we know Canada failed to gain a temporary seat on the Security Council recently. So what should Canada's role be? What should we be pushing our politicians to do on that international stage going forward? Mosi.
They have to pay attention. They have to pay some sort of attention. You know, maybe your focus isn't as strong as it was in previous years, given as to what's happening here now. But it is very important, especially being the type of power country that we are, that we do pay attention to what's going on and do provide some sort of funding and help to the UN or to nations that do need it. It's just reciprocity. That's really what it boils down to. May not be as strong as it was before, but there still needs to be some sort of presence.
Well, maybe they're watching and they'll take a cue from us. Nora, last word to you on what Canadians should be telling their politicians to do on the world stage and as it's represented at the United Nations.
Yeah, well, you know, for many generations of Canadians, we understand our role with the United Nations has been a role of peacekeeping, of being present when necessary or when being called on. And of course, a lot of that is myth-making, but there's truth to it as well. And that has really fallen away. I think we're living in this global pandemic, and we need to understand the pandemic is a pandemic of communities. And that doesn't just mean communities locally, that means the global community as well. And as long as COVID is raging in one part of the world, there will still be a threat to Canadians if you really want to look at it in kind of a selfish kind of way. And so we need our leadership to engage internationally to fight to make sure that vaccine distribution and manufacturing is more open. And is the United Nations the location to do it? Well, it's definitely an important location and one of the few locations. And so I would like to see our leadership talking about what they're doing at the United Nations and what they're promising to help, you know, address this pandemic in the perspective that it requires, which is not individualistic personally, not individualistic nationally, but globally.
Listening to both of you, I'm tempted to, I was going to say quote, I'll probably end up misquoting Winston Churchill when he asked about democracy, said of course it's a horrible system, but have you considered the alternative? Maybe we could say the same thing about the UN. Thanks to you both, freelance writer Nora Loretto in Quebec City and lawyer Mosi Taylor Cole in Calgary.